welcome to CCU's lesson tonight. It is a second part lesson of 2 in a series on conservative outreach. This one's going to get more into the practice tonight. And as we said kind of in the intro hook, if you're struggling to share, you're concerned about climate risk with conservative friends, family, and folks in the community in a way that resonates, you found the right place. Tonight we're going to have Peter Bryn jump in to really helping us walk through and navigate that communication background and skill set recommendation. Peter, if you wouldn't mind advancing, I'll just give you a quick little bio. So Peter's been CCL's conservative director for the past year and a half and is responsible for growing our conservative volunteer base, helping volunteers work with conservative audiences, and guiding the activities of CCL's Conservative Caucus, all of which he'll get into here in a little bit. He's actually transitioning out of that role, and I'll let him speak to that himself in a little bit, with just Jim Tolbert also is co-director right now. And before being with CCL as the conservative director, Peter's been spending his career as an engineer with ExxonMobil. He was a veteran of 8 years there in the energy industry because of a concern about the dual challenges of providing affordable energy to the world while responsibly managing climate risk. So I'll turn it over to you, Peter. You can also you can already hear a little conservative framing there in your own biography, and we're honored to have you on tonight's CCU and learn a lot from all of your background and skill set in this area.
All right. Well, thanks, Brett, and thank you to everybody for joining tonight. I appreciate the introduction. As Brett mentioned, I'm actually, I am in transition right now, so my girlfriend and I are excited to say that we're going to be traveling the world next year. We're going to backpack for a year. So Jim Tolbert in the Asheville chapter and also active with our Conservative Caucus is going to be taking over for me. We're in the process of that transition right now, and so but Jim, as I mentioned earlier, is off at the Young Americans for Liberty conference with tabling for CCL and hopefully getting a whole bunch of new libertarian volunteers in the organization. So Brett did that poll before we got started with some of the learning goals to see what people are interested in, and there are a few that we want to share here. So the goals for this lesson are to help you improve your communication skills for engaging conservative audiences. We know that on this particular topic that can often be tricky for some. To develop your strategy and practice to engage more conservatives in your own network. So how do we get sort of more folks into the fold? And to retain conservative volunteers by ensuring that CCL is a welcome place for all political persuasions. One thing I did notice in the polling is that third one on there wasn't perhaps what brought as many folks here as compared to developing your own strategy. But I would encourage us to think about this as a really key one, wanting to make sure that as conservative volunteers find their way into CCL, they come to their first meeting and find it as a comfortable place for them, where they don't feel like they're sort of out of place amongst their peers in the room. We want to make sure it's a comfortable place for everybody. So the agenda, there's a couple of key things on the agenda tonight. And some of this comes from what we learned from the 101. So if you saw the earlier version of this, you'll know that, and we're going to repeat this every 6 months or so, this conservative messaging. But the 101, we kind of looked at the theory behind conservative messaging and sort of what makes a lot of conservative minds work, and kind of broke down the current Republican Party. We spent a lot of time on that. If you didn't get a chance to look at it, there's a lot of really good references that were used to develop that. I'd recommend taking a look at that. Tonight, we're going to do the sort of the practice side of it, taking what we learned in 101 and applying it. So one of the key things we learned in 101 was that we need to first and foremost become a trusted messenger. Then we want to spend some time tonight practicing how do we respond to typical objections we might get from conservative friends, family, and audiences. Then we want to talk a little bit about what's CCL's conservative street cred. What are some of the tools that you can have up your sleeve to sort of let people know that we're serious about being nonpartisan and actually having a policy proposal that really does have a lot of attractive features for conservatives. And finally, finish up with looking at some of the CCL community tools that are available to help you on this. So as I mentioned before, this is a 2-part series. We're attempting to repeat at least the practice workshop part of this every 6 months or so on CCU. We also are trying to get this particular workshop piece into the regional conferences. We did it this year at the annual conference in DC. So we really want to make sure that this session becomes sort of a regular piece of a lot of events that CCL does. So if we go back to 101, what we did was we kind of looked through all these resources and we kept aggregating the lessons that we were pulling together. And we came up with a really long list, but I'm going to focus on sort of 5 top takeaways that from 101 to sort of hone in on. And the reason I picked these 5 is I just think that they're probably the most pertinent for what we're trying to achieve. So the first, as I mentioned before, is become a trusted messenger. It's often, we often say that the messenger is more important than the message, or as important as the message. People won't hear you until they trust you, right? And so in CCL, we often talk about listening for values, trying to understand what's really behind what somebody's saying rather than responding to their immediate objection. So we're going to focus tonight on listening for values and also making sure that we make a good first impression. The second big takeaway of the top 5 from the last lesson is that many conservatives are ready to act. It's often said that, oh, Republicans don't care about climate change, or they don't accept the science. And I would say we need to be careful we need to be careful with our language. If we get sloppy with our language, then we put ourselves into sort of a self-perpetuating, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, basically. If we say conservatives don't care about climate change, then we're already putting ourselves in that mindset of, well, whoever I talk to isn't going to care. And it also, frankly, doesn't align with the polling. If you look at the polling data, it's very clear that there are strong majorities, even amongst most conservative Republicans, that at least acknowledge climate change is occurring, and the various levels of support for whether or not they support taking action. But if, again, I go into it with the mindset of there's at least 50% of the people here who will agree with me and at least be open to considering what I'm proposing. So let's make sure to go in it with the right mindset and recognize that the polling is on our side. Solution aversion. This was a big one. And this is a term that Congressman Bob Inglis, who many of you are familiar with, often uses, and I think he says it very well. He basically says that at the heart of climate skepticism, for whatever arguments or excuses people might throw at us, really what's behind that is a concern about the solutions. If people are not satisfied that, or if people think that if I accept climate change, what I'm really accepting is I need to turn my air conditioning off, I need to give up my car, I got to stop living life the way that I've become accustomed to living it. If people, when you say climate change, if they hear that, then of course they're going to push back, because that's not a very attractive proposition. So what we need to do in our communication is just get that right up front and say, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about doing energy better, doing it cleaner, doing it more efficiently, more affordably. We want to do things better. We're not talking about giving up your way of life. We're just talking about doing energy better. Uncertainty. Uncertainty doesn't paralyze us. It drives us to manage risk. Now, what does this mean? So oftentimes the argument is thrown at us that, well, we're not certain about what climate change is, and the scientists still aren't sure, and we're not 100% sure, so we shouldn't act. Now, of course, that's a silly argument. So how do we respond to that? Well, we don't respond to it by saying, no, the science is settled, it's done, there's no more argument, no more debate, because obviously people are going to push back on that and say, well, science is never really settled. So instead, we need to put it in terms of risk management and say things like, well, look, we don't have certainty about most things in our lives. We don't have certainty about the weather. Well, that's a very bad example because we're talking climate change, but that's why we buy insurance for hurricanes. We don't have certainty about our car. That's why we have auto insurance. The military doesn't have certainty when it goes into a certain battle, so they try to manage that risk in the same way that any business tries to manage that risk. At ExxonMobil, we would drill wells all the time, and you try to minimize your risk by reducing your exposure to the risk. So uncertainty doesn't paralyze us. Don't be afraid when people start throwing the doubt or the uncertainty. You can respond with, yeah, but it's still a risk, and how are we going to respond to that risk and manage it? And finally, reference trusted validators. So there are a lot of folks out there, more and more these days, who are talking about the need to act on climate change, folks from the business community, Department of Defense, conservative thought leaders, and some of that's on CCL community, and we'll look more into that in a little bit. So these are some of the top takeaways I'd like you to think about as we go into tonight's presentation. So let's start with the becoming a trusted messenger. First impressions matter. So I'd like you to do a thought experiment for a second and say, what are these, aside from being presidents, what do these three folks have in common? Well, you might say your initial reaction might be not much, but one thing they all have in common is that they are all trusted messengers for certain segments of the population. And their followers will give significant deference to what they are going to say. Even, whether logically it makes sense or not, they'll just follow these folks and agree with whatever they have to say. And so that's the importance of being a trusted messenger. One good example of this came from a Republican club president to a CCL volunteer, and he said, "I very much respect what you're doing, and more so you, and actually agree with most of your mission. I'm always sure of your integrity, which sways me when I'm not sure about your proposal. You'll know I'll always be willing to help you." So here he's basically saying, I'm not 100% sure I'm 100% on board with what you're proposing yet, but I really trust you and I understand what you're trying to achieve, and therefore I'm here to help. So with that, let's meet Jennifer. Jennifer is somebody we just met. She's going to be the person we're trying to start a conversation with. We just met her. She's friendly and she's conservative. So now, like I said before, not every conservative is the same. But in Jennifer's case, let's assume that Jennifer, in her mind, she's thinking, well, climate change isn't a high priority. More taxes are bad for the economy and for jobs. And she doesn't want the government telling her what to do, right? That's her particular mindset. So how do we become a trusted messenger and start our conversation with Jennifer? Now, we don't want it to be like this, right? We don't want it to be the awkward Thanksgiving dinner. We want it to be a positive, productive conversation. So we want to show her that we're a trusted messenger. First of all, if you go in, let's say you're doing outreach to a local conservative group on behalf of CCL. The first thing you want to do in the room when you walk in is be confident, right? You're really there to make friends. You're not there to convince anybody of anything just yet. All you want to do is start making friends. And remember, there's about a 50% chance that Jennifer might support climate action because polling would suggest that. Be credible, right? Look presentable, that's obvious. Mention you're a volunteer, that's important to folks. You know, I'm not paid to be here, I'm a volunteer. And key is to avoid alarmism and hyperbole. We don't want to say extreme things. We want to be very measured in our messaging. We can still be passionate, but we have to be reasonable and measured. We need to be responsive, right? So again, listen for values. Those of you who are familiar with Ellie Sparks and her Move Over Misconception project, that's really all about listening for values. And again, we're not trying to sell Jennifer on anything until she asks. Be relatable, right? So we want to mention our conservative credentials if we have any. We want to describe why we're a volunteer. Give your personal story. We often talk about that. Seek common ground and don't lead with science or data. In fact, really try to avoid science and data. That's just a rabbit hole that's going to suck up all your time and probably not get you anywhere. So how do we present ourselves? You know, again, we want to avoid terms that may sort of turn Jennifer off. So things you probably don't want to say are things like climate crisis or talking about doom and gloom. Climate justice is probably not something that is going to interest her. Instead, we want to focus again on language that might appeal more to, you know, a business-minded person or somebody who's thinking in terms of that. So we talk about the challenge of climate change, managing the risks, concern about the economy, businesses, farms, infrastructure, advocating for solutions as opposed to just complaining about the problem, protecting quality of life for Americans, conservation, stewardship. All these kinds of terms are more likely to resonate with Jennifer than the alternative. So the first thing we're going to do is practice our introduction, and we're going to break out into work groups in a second here to do this. So some of the takeaways from 101 that are applicable here, again, first impressions matter. We already mentioned that. And so I've got my sample introduction that I'd like to share here. And with this, we can you can use as you see fit. And so mine is something like this. I'll often say something like, I was at ExxonMobil for 8 years, but I resigned a few years ago, and now I'm working full-time with Congress to advocate for a market-based climate and energy policy. Now, it's a little wordy, but that's roughly along the lines of what I would say. Okay, so one, first impressions matter. Two, I didn't lead with science or data, right? I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to say that science behind climate change is really scary and it's bad and all those kinds of things. So I just kept it, I avoided that. Three, tackle solution aversion, right? We said we wanted to do that. And so by saying market-based, those two words are very powerful in the communications that we're trying to get into. What that says to somebody is, this person cares about the economy. This person is thinking in terms of a policy that is not just all top-down command and control, but understands the importance of the economy. So that should resonate somewhat with Jennifer and make her think, okay, maybe I got to listen to this person. Reference trusted validators. Now, in my case, I worked in the oil and gas industry. Here in Houston, that goes far. But, in your community, look into your background, look into what you do. It could be anything from a military concern. It could be concern about local flooding, if that's an issue in your neighborhood. It doesn't have to be necessarily conservative, but just reference something that you think would be relatable, and if anything, could help validate some conservative leanings that you may have. And again, recognize competing priorities and avoid hyperbole. I always like to say climate and energy policy to recognize the fact that, again, it's not enough to just focus on climate change, but it's important to have energy be affordable as well, because that's probably high on Jennifer's list of concerns. So at this point, I'm going to ask Brett to help us out because we're going to workshop our introduction. I've put the top 5 takeaways from 101 there that you can consider here. What I'd like us to do is we'll break out for about 3 minutes. So at about you'll have to keep track of your time because we don't have a way to flash up when we hit the halfway point. But at about 1.5 minutes, we'll ask you to switch. And so give some thought to how you might want to workshop your introduction and what you might say if you're walking into this scenario. So Brett, I'm going to hand it back to you for a second to walk us through the workshop.
Yeah, so the great thing about Zoom, the platform that we're on right now, is whether you're calling in on the phone.
That's fine. So we've made our introduction to Jennifer. Now we want to frame our message because let's say Jennifer says, okay, I appreciate the introduction. You sound like somebody I want to talk to, but maybe she has skepticism or doubt and she wants to throw an objection up. So we're going to talk about framing our message and pivoting. So of course, framing is key because, one person's economic stimulus is another person's deficit spending. So we have to be really, thoughtful about how we frame things. So Jennifer may object. And what we're going to do is we're going to throw up a series of the typical types of objections you've probably heard over time. Things like one volcano puts out more CO2 than people ever will, or when the government tried to solve this problem, we ended up with Solyndra. Or we need to worry about real threats today, not about a few millimeters of sea level rise in 100 years, right? We've all heard these kinds of objections. So we need to figure out how we're going to respond. Are we going to freak out and yell and scream and tell her why she's wrong? Or are we going to play it cool, right? We're going to play it like the Fonz. This is the only time I ever tell people to be like the Fonz. We got to be cool with this, right? So how are we going to play it cool? So first of all, don't take the bait. If you're talking to a hardline conservative-minded person, oftentimes they're going to have talking points, just like we all do. I mean, like we're all guilty of it, right? There's a certain topic that everybody on this line is very educated on climate change, but we're not as well educated on a lot of other topics. And so when other topics come up, we all kind of have our talking points. So Jennifer's objections will probably be talking points that she's heard and is repeating that do resonate with her. So the first thing is we don't want to take the bait. We don't want to just point out why we think perhaps Jennifer's wrong. She doesn't necessarily want an argument, but she's probably expecting one. Listen for values, right? Is her objection really the core issue? Or is there something behind it that's really bothering her about this? Find common ground, right? First, see if you can find something to agree on. And if you can agree with what she said, then maybe you can agree with the underlying value. Then pivot to the solution and try to include Jennifer in it. For example, is she a Republican? Well, that's great. Her party has the tools to solve this. It's free enterprise. say, look, I understand the importance of innovation and the private sector putting products out there that are going to help us decarbonize. We're not going to be able to get there without it. Does she work in the fossil fuel industry? Even better. Her industry has the science and the engineering and the project management know-how to build out the low carbon economy in the future. These companies are very adaptable and they have a lot of engineering and scientific know-how. We need her as part of the solution. So we got to try to incorporate her in the solution somehow. So the first theme of objections we're going to focus on are ones related to economics, energy, and free markets. These were some of the themes we explored in 101. So a couple of the typical objections. One is the Solyndra one. Another one is we do much more to protect the environment than China or India. Regulations are just going to move production to where it's dirtier. Fracking is leading us into a manufacturing renaissance. The last thing we need to do is burden our industries with new costs, right? Now, there's probably some trigger words in here that might get some people worked up and wanting to respond, but try not to take the bait, right? Instead, what we're going to do is try to listen for values. So in that first objection about China and India, what is she really saying? What she's saying is that she wants a strong economy and that it's hypocritical to think that, well, we're going to hurt ourselves. We're just going to send that production elsewhere, right? So in her mind, this is, why would we act? It's not fair. We're just going to send our industries overseas. So we got to think about how to respond to the fact that she's concerned about the economy. With Solyndra, she's saying she likes free markets, right? She doesn't want the government investing in specific companies. And with fracking, again, she's trying to say she wants low energy costs because she wants a strong economy. She's not necessarily in love with fracking as a technology, but she wants the affordable energy that comes with it. So how do we respond, right? She might be expecting us to bemoan capitalism and say those kinds of things because that's what she's used to. But instead, let's see if we can empower capitalism as part of the solution, because that's what Jennifer probably needs to hear. Again, we could talk about free enterprise being able to solve this problem, that the market shouldn't put taxpayers on the hook, right? We want to make sure everybody's accountable for their solutions. One thing I'd really like to say is, why are we taxing, why not tax something we want less of, pollution, and untax what we want more of, income, capital, things like that? So why aren't we taxing pollution? We tax other stuff. That's kind of silly. That's a very libertarian-friendly argument, by the way. We need a strong economy so we can have a strong environment. Sure, that's something that'll probably resonate with her, and some of the other things there too. So these are some of the things that we want to, that could be part of a response that, again, include her in the solution and will resonate with Jennifer. She's probably also expecting us, perhaps, if you're in the gentleman I just was in the breakout room with is in northern Colorado, big oil and gas area there, particularly fracking. She's probably expecting us to bemoan the industry and fossil fuels, to say things like, no, we got to move to renewables and we got to divest from fossil fuel companies, and basically making the fossil fuel companies the enemy, as opposed to saying, look, it's a societal problem and we really need these. If we set the economics right, these fossil fuel companies could be part of the solution. So we got to make sure that we're focused on emissions, not on fossil fuels themselves, because that's often we get tripped up on that. And so, we say that we're for a low carbon, all of the above energy economy, right? All of the above is what every Republican member of Congress says that they support in energy. So if we can say that, but just say we just want to reduce emissions along the way, that should resonate pretty well. We want to talk about energy affordability being critical and why we need to be careful about how we implement our policies. Again, we're not trying to eliminate fossil fuels, we just want to reduce emissions. And with carbon capture and sequestration, you can do both. You're not eliminating fuels, but you are reducing emissions. Government shouldn't pick winners and losers. Instead, we put a price on it and let the market figure out the rest. And the oil and gas industry has the scientists, engineers, and project management to solve this challenge, right? So these are some of the things, talking points you might want to bring up. So what is a sample response to the China and India one, right? She says, we do much more to protect the environment than China or India. Regulations are just going to move production to where it's dirtier. Sample response could be, well, I agree, we can't put our economy at risk, right? That's what she's really saying. She's worried about the economy. That's exactly why our policy proposal includes a border adjustment that will protect American business from increasing costs and avoid sending jobs and emissions overseas. So now we're going to do our breakouts again. And we've got the two other objections we put up earlier. The first one being, when the government tried to solve this problem, we ended up with Solyndra. and the other one being fracking is leading us into a manufacturing renaissance. The last thing we need is to burden our industries with new costs. So pick either one of those objections, whichever one's your favorite, and we'll break out into our breakout rooms and see if we can respond to it without taking the bait, listening for values, finding common ground, and pivoting to the solutions. So Brett, let me hand it back to you again. So basically the next two components are just more objections and more things for you to practice responding to. And even if we're not able to practice them here tonight, I recommend, maybe after the fact going through and I've tried to catalog some of the best objections that I've heard over the years. So again, these ones, the second theme has to do more with liberty, being concerned about government spending, patriotism, and accountability. These four topics are kind of lumped together. They're not all 100% aligned, but they're kind of in the same sphere. So, one potential objection you might hear is renewable energy couldn't succeed without handouts. We've had clean nuclear energy for years, but environmentalists won't let us build anymore. Or windmills consume more energy than they put out, and they kill birds. That is a real quote, by the way. The UN's climate change agenda is to threaten U.S. sovereignty. Right, so again, we want to listen for values. The sovereignty one is concerned about government overreach. The one at the bottom there about renewable energy is about government intervention in markets. So how can we respond to that? And about windmills, it's all about accountability. And actually, we'll show in a minute how we responded to that particular one on the accountability theme in a second. So again, she's expecting us to freak out and say, no, that we have to involve the UN, we have to involve the EPA. The nice thing about our policy is it doesn't require either. Our policy doesn't involve the UN and it doesn't involve the EPA as the regulatory authority. So, we can say that, look, we support liberty and limited government too. American leadership, greatness, opportunity, and competitiveness, focus on those themes. Talking about, having America be a leader in these technologies. Limited government control with simple, practical solutions, right? Our policy is very simple. That's the nice feature of it. It doesn't create a whole bureaucracy. We want a market-based approach. We don't want any free riders, right? Our border adjustment takes care of the China and India question. So yes, we need them to act to solve the issue, but in the meantime, we're not hurting ourselves with our policy because the border adjustment protects us. We want to say no to hypocrisy and yes to accountability. You'll probably get well, what about Al Gore's mansion? And when I get that question, I say, well, guess what? He's going to pay more because he's got a big mansion. And that's what happens to folks who consume a lot of fossil fuels. So that response usually goes over pretty well. And we could talk about energy freedom, having energy freedom of choice. We're not dictating solutions. We're allowing the market to do that. So on the windmills one, windmills consume more energy than they put out and they kill birds. The way that we responded to that, and I was in the meeting when this came up, we say, we agree that if windmills are killing birds, they should be held accountable. We believe all fuels should be held accountable for their cost and create a level playing field for the consumer. So we were able to pivot from this to try to make a positive statement out of it, and it really did open up the conversation with this kind of response. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this breakout session, and we're going to do the next one instead. So that I'm just going to keep going.
Sense. Yep.
The final theme that I wanted to go through, and the reason I skipped that one is because I think this theme is a little bit more direct. I think this third theme is perhaps more direct to kind of how we talk about ourselves and how we talk about climate change advocacy, because these questions will kind of come up. So how do we talk about ourselves and what we're doing as an organization and science when it does come up? So the objections here start to talk about climate, right? The leaked ClimateGate emails showed that this whole thing was a fraud, right? We hear that one a lot. The one volcano puts out more CO2. We hear that one sometimes. The science is unsettled. There's been no warming in 18 years, and anyway, the Earth was warmer during the medieval warming period. In the 1970s, they were talking about global cooling, and it was global warming. Now it's climate change, and they blame it for everything, right? People are confused. They keep hearing all these different terms. They don't know what to think. So there are, if we start listening for values here, what are they really trying to say? She says, okay, well, on the uncertainty one, she says, well, we shouldn't act unless, we have certainty. The one volcano one says, basically, she's saying, it's unfathomable. I can't imagine it we're possibly changing the climate, something so big. On the climate gate emails, and that is a big issue for a lot of people, even regardless of whether it was legitimate or not, it's a big issue for people. I've encountered it. That's getting at dishonesty and hypocrisy, right? They're saying this is all about, and this gets back to the Al Gore mansion thing, right? Well, he's running around telling us what to do, but he lives in a big house. That's the perception that folks have, and I've heard all these things. And also uncertainty with global warming, global cooling, climate change, all that, right? But again, all of this uncertainty about the science and the scientific process, if we really listen for values, the whole reason, why are they questioning the uncertainty, or why are they questioning the uncertainty in the first place? Does anybody question the certainty of cancer research? Does anybody question the doctors that are, or the scientists who are working on, building cars or building bridges? Or no, nobody questions that, because there's no, accepting that science doesn't lead to any problems. Here, the thought is the solution's worse than the problem. I'm going to really challenge every step of that scientific process, because I'm afraid of accepting the results which tell me that I have to change my lifestyle. So this all gets back to the solution aversion question. If you ever get hit with a science question, if you know the answer, that's great, and you can get into a conversation down the road. But my initial reaction would be pivot back to saying, you can accept the science, it's okay. You don't have to be afraid. The solution isn't, it's actually really exciting if you think about it. So how do we respond to this, right? We don't want to say climate denier. We don't want to say Republicans don't believe in the science, or the science is settled. We don't want to hit them with all that stuff, because that's just going to backfire. It just gives them things to object to. Instead, again, we want to say that she's part of the solution, and the solution can be really exciting. So, if she says uncertainty, again, we could talk about responsible risk management and how the economy can benefit. The reasonable insurance policy argument, we can say that there's a huge opportunity for America to lead on this. Some folks often point out that China's leading right now on solar technology because they've invested so much in it, and we're missing out on that, and that's true. And talk about businesses and entrepreneurs and their ability to innovate our way out of this problem, but they need a price signal to do it, and that's what our policy does. So on the ClimateGate email ones, this shows this whole thing was a fraud. You could say something like, well, it's true that science always evolves. And look, there may have been a few bad actors, maybe not, I don't know. But to me, that doesn't invalidate the weight of the evidence that there's a real risk here. And so what we're proposing is to take out an insurance policy on that risk to stave off the worst effects without breaking the bank. So you're trying to soften that to say, look, the solution isn't as scary as you think. And so with that, why don't we do our final breakout session here in the time that we have. The two objections are the science is unsettled. There's been no warming for 18 years. And the other one is the one about volcanoes. Brett, take it away. What we really want Jennifer to walk away with is, again, we're not trying to convince her or anything. We're just trying to show her that we're a good person to talk to, somebody she can trust, somebody who maybe shares some of her worldview, if not all of her worldview. She's maybe intrigued to learn more, like, well, you've opened me to a perspective I haven't heard before on climate. And, if it's important to you, well, maybe it should be important to me because you're a trusted messenger. And she's still smiling, right? That's good news. So with that, why don't we finish up? And there's two more quick units we'll go through. I want to share some of our conservative street cred first. What are some of the things that we can share with Jennifer to show her we're not really in disguise, right? We're not trying to bring her over to a whole different mindset that's not her. But in fact, that we do have some what I would call conservative street cred. So how do we talk about CCL as an organization? I think it was Lori earlier who was talking about how nonpartisan CCL is and that appeal to her. And I think that's really key, showing that we're truly nonpartisan, that we're nonprofit, and we try to work with everybody, left, right, and center. That we don't demonize anybody, that we're working with all members of Congress across the country, that we're solution focused, we're for things rather than against them, and that we're seeking Republican introduction of our bill, right? We absolutely need Republicans to be the lead on our bill. And that our organization was very much behind the Republican Climate Resolution and the Climate Solutions Caucus. You can reference our conservative caucus within CCL. So this is a group, a subgroup of CCL volunteers. We're stand at almost 200 now, who are Republican, Libertarian, and/or conservative CCL volunteers who are working on conservative outreach all around the country. We have our conservative homepage. It's admittedly not much to look at right now. It's kind of basic, but if you go to citizensclimatelobby.org/conservatives, you'll get landed here. So if you do meet somebody who's conservative and they want to learn more about CCL, you can send them here. It tells them a little bit about the Conservative Caucus, and they can join CCL through there, and they'll also get signed up for the Conservative Caucus. And what's some of our conservative street cred around outreach? So we're engaging many conservative and business organizations through the caucus, the Business Climate Leaders Action Team that many of you are familiar with, Team Oil. All of these groups are doing a lot of outreach to names that will resonate with conservative audiences. We've met with Wall Street Journal, with API, National Association of Manufacturers. These are big industry groups. We've met with different Republican organizations and so on. So, you know, this is just good to be aware of as you talk to folks and say, look, we're engaging everybody. Our conservative caucus on a local level is engaging Republican clubs. Several states we're working on influencing our party the GOP party platform, trying to get statements on the party platforms in several places to acknowledge or support carbon pricing. And we host conservative speakers all around the country. And of course, don't forget our advisory board. You know, we have some names on our advisory board, particularly George Schultz and Bob Inglis and Dr. Hayhoe, that are, have a lot of good conservative street cred. They may not be known to the person you're talking to, but if you explain who they are, I think that would go pretty far. And also, pivoting from CCL to our policy for a second, carbon fee and dividend, there's a lot of support out there amongst different conservative thought leaders that support a policy, either carbon fee and dividend or something like that. Of course, since this presentation was first put together, we've added the Climate Leadership Council. We've added another group called the Alliance for Market Solutions. These are right-of-center think tanks and organizations that are trying to build support for policies that are similar to carbon fee and dividend. And when we first put this together, Rex Tillerson was not the Secretary of State, so that's another advancement. And if you go on the CCL community, and we'll show this in a second where you can find this, there is a handout that has a list of conservative thought leaders that have a lot of conservative street cred who support our policy or something like it. So finally, the last module, I just want to run through some things that are on CCL community that might be of interest to you that could help this. Now, with the new CCL Community 2.0, which is vastly improved, if you go to the Action Center, click Take Action, and then scroll down, you'll see this called Community Outreach on the left. If you click that, it will take you to a list of different specific communities that you might be outreaching to, one being conservatives. If you click on conservative outreach, we have a bunch of resources, including these flyers. We have a full page flyer and a quarter page flyer. And also from there, and there's other resources as well, but also from there, you will find a link to the Conservative Caucus. And so I would invite anybody on the line. We do kind of have a litmus test, I would say, to try to make sure that the caucus is really full of either Republican, Libertarian, or fiscally conservative independent folks. So if you don't self-identify as one of those, then maybe the caucus isn't the best fit. But if you do kind of self-identify in one of those categories, we'd love to add you to the caucus. So you could go ahead and apply for a membership, and we'd love to have you there. We're really trying to grow the caucus and get more folks in there, because the more people we have in the caucus, the more outreach we can do all over the country to more and more conservative groups. You can find the caucus from that previous page I showed, or if you click the Connect button at the top, you'll find the Conservative Caucus under the Action Team list. And with that, I think we just made our time, and we'll wrap up here. And Brett,